What happens when a forgotten woman finds love behind bars and pays for it with her life? At 62 years old, Claudine Harris had long been forgotten by the world outside the concrete walls of St. Helena Women's Correctional Center in Louisiana. She hadn't had a visitor in nearly 9 years. Her daughter stopped writing after her high school graduation, and the few remaining friends she once had either moved on or passed away. To the prison system, Claudine was just another aging inmate taking up space, a shadow that kept to herself, spoke softly, and spent most of her days in the prison library. But behind those tired brown eyes and salt and pepper curls was a story few ever bothered to learn. Before she was inmate number 762804, Claudine had been a music teacher in New Orleans. She taught piano, led church choirs, and believed every broken soul could be mended through melody. Her life fell apart in 2008 when a domestic dispute with her husband, who'd been beating her for years, ended with a kitchen knife and a pool of blood on their apartment floor. The court didn't believe it was self-defense. Neither did the press. And so, Claudine was sentenced to 25 years for second-degree murder, stripped of her name, dignity, and future. Now, 17 years into that sentence, she moved slowly, her knees aching from arthritis, her fingers no longer nimble enough for piano. Still, the younger inmates respected her. They called her Mama C, a mix of endearment and reverence. She was the one you went to if you were scared, or if you just needed someone to listen without judgment. She never asked for anything in return. She kept her cell neat, wrote poetry in the margins of old hymnals, and sang softly to herself at night. Spirituals mostly, the kind her grandmother taught her. The guards liked her. She followed rules, never caused trouble. But none of them ever really saw her. Not until Jordan Miles showed up. Jordan was 28, young, clean-shaven, with soft hazel eyes and a jawline too sharp for his own good. He wasn't like the other corrections officers. He didn't talk down to the women. He didn't bark orders or walk with a power trip. He was polite, distant, but polite. On his second week at St. Helena, he got assigned to the prison library, where Claudine worked stacking books and maintaining a decades-old checkout ledger by hand. The first time their eyes met, she offered him a gentle smile. He nodded. That was it. But the second time, he stayed longer. "You ever read Baldwin?" he asked, holding up the fire next time. Claudine looked up from her cart. "I lived it." That made Jordan chuckle, something Claudine hadn't heard from a guard in years. And from that moment on, he kept coming back, sometimes to shell books, sometimes just to talk. The two of them would discuss poetry, theology, jazz. He asked her about New Orleans. She asked him about his life, though he rarely answered in full. Still, the bond grew, slowly, quietly, imperceptibly at first, until one afternoon, Claudine found herself waiting for him, ear-tuned for the soft creak of his boots down the hallway. She hated that she could still feel something like anticipation, like yearning. He was a boy, and she was an old woman doing time in a place meant to erase her. But Jordan didn't see her that way. To him, she was a mind worth talking to, a voice worth hearing. She didn't flirt, didn't pretend to be anything she wasn't. She just spoke her truth, and that, in a place where everyone wore masks and traded favors, made her different. One day, as he passed her a worn copy of Song of Solomon, their hands touched, just briefly, but enough for both of them to notice. Neither said anything. That night, in her bunk, Claudine stared at the ceiling and whispered a prayer she hadn't dared say in years. "Lord, don't let this be a trick of loneliness. Don't let me fall for a ghost." But deep down, a quiet truth began to hum inside her, soft and unsettling, like the opening chord of a song she hadn't heard in decades. It scared her more than prison ever did. It started with books. Then came the conversations. Then came the quiet moments, long stretches of silence that somehow said more than words ever could. Jordan began spending more time in the library, long after his rounds were technically done. The other guards teased him, called it babysitting the choir lady, but he didn't care. He liked the way Claudine spoke, the way she never rushed a thought, never filled silence with noise. In a world full of locked doors, She was the only one who made him feel untrapped. Jordan had his own ghosts. He never talked about his father. But Claudine figured it out when she noticed the way his hands shook ever so slightly when he talked about back home. He'd grown up in a trailer in Baldwin County, Alabama. His mom worked 2 jobs and still couldn't keep the lights on half the month. She died when he was 19, and Jordan had been raising his kid brother ever since. He never said it outright, but Claudine knew that the pain in his eyes wasn't just fatigue. It was the ache of someone carrying far more than they should at his age. Sometimes they talked about things that had nothing to do with prison. About music, about God, about forgiveness. Other times they didn't talk at all. They just existed in the same space. Her shelving books, him leaning against the desk with a worn-out paperback in hand. Claudine didn't know when the lines started to blur. Maybe it was the day Jordan brought her a honey bun from the staff vending machine and told her quietly, "You shouldn't have to eat powdered eggs on your birthday." Maybe it was the night she caught herself humming while cleaning the piano keys after he left. Or maybe it was that afternoon in early spring when the fluorescent light above the checkout desk flickered out and Jordan reached up to change the bulb. His shirt lifted slightly, revealing the faded tattoo on his ribs. "I protect what's mine." Claudine looked away. She was too old for this. Too tired. Too broken. Too forgotten. But that didn't stop the flutter in her chest when he said her name. Not Inmate Harris, just Claudine. It wasn't supposed to happen. Not really. But one Friday, he lingered too long. The prison was quieter than usual, rain tapping on the narrow windows, most inmates in the rec hall for movie night. He asked her out of nowhere, "Did you ever wish you could go back?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Only every time I hear a minor chord." He chuckled softly. "Yeah, me too. Different reason, though." They didn't kiss. Not then. That would come later. What they did was sit together on the cracked vinyl bench next to the piano. He played a few notes with one finger. She corrected him. He laughed. She laughed too, really laughed, for the first time in years. And that's when it shifted. He didn't see a prisoner. She didn't see a guard. They saw 2 people who'd lost too much, held on too long, and found a strange, quiet safety in each other. Over the weeks, the meetings became riskier. One time in the music room, another in the supply closet behind the library. Never long, never spoken about after, but it was real, more real than anything either of them had felt in a long time. Claudine knew it couldn't last, that it shouldn't last, yet part of her clung to it. Not because she was naive, but because for the first time in nearly 2 decades, she felt alive. Not like a statistic, not like a lesson, but like a woman. Jordan wasn't using her. He wasn't playing her. He was escaping with her. And when he held her hand, just briefly, before slipping out the door with his head low and eyes burning, Claudine whispered a truth she hadn't dared admit even to herself. "This is wrong, but it's the only thing that's ever felt right in here." She knew they were dancing on the edge of disaster. She just didn't know how close they were to the fall. Claudine had always known her body like a familiar hymn. Its aches, its silences, its betrayals. But in early June, something felt different. At first, it was fatigue, the kind that clung to her bones even after a full night's sleep. Then came the nausea, subtle at first, an uneasiness during breakfast, but it grew stronger by the day. One morning, after vomiting behind a bookshelf in the library, she knew it wasn't just the prison food. She tried to convince herself it was the flu, stress, age, but deep down she already knew, and it terrified her. A week later, she was called to the prison infirmary. Nurse Simmons, a woman with the warmth of a brick wall, ran the tests in silence. Claudine sat on the edge of the metal exam table, the paper beneath her crackling with every nervous shift. When Simmons returned, she didn't speak right away. She just stared. Finally, she dropped the file on the counter and crossed her arms. "You're pregnant." Claudine blinked. "Excuse me. 6 to 10 weeks along, by the looks of it. Congratulations, I guess." The word hit like a bullet. Pregnant. At 62. In prison. With no husband. No conjugal visits. No rights. She could barely breathe. The news spread faster than wildfire. Within 48 hours, every block was buzzing. "Did you hear Mama C's having a baby?" She too old for that mess. Girl, she must have snuck a syringe from the medical ward or something. No. Bet it was one of them guards. They weren't wrong. Warden Celeste Monroe had been in charge at St. Helena for 6 years. She ran the facility like a military base. No weakness, no excuses, and she hated surprises, especially ones that could make the Department of Corrections look bad. By Monday morning, Monroe had ordered a full internal audit. Interviews, surveillance footage, access logs. No stone unturned. She called Claudine into her office, a concrete room with no windows and one steel chair. Monroe didn't offer a greeting. You want to tell me how the hell a 62-year-old woman gets knocked up in my prison? Claudine stayed silent. Monroe leaned forward. I can protect you, but only if you give me a name. Still, Claudine said nothing, because no matter how much her stomach twisted with fear, no matter how close the walls pressed in, she would not offer Jordan up to be slaughtered. Not when he was the first man in decades to treat her like she mattered. Meanwhile, Jordan was unraveling. He avoided the library, stopped making eye contact with the other guards. He knew the rumors. He'd heard them in the break room, on the yard, even over the radio chatter. One morning, Monroe summoned him to the administrative wing. She didn't yell, didn't accuse. She just slid a printed photo across the table, security footage blurry but damning. Jordan entering the library after hours. Unscheduled. Alone. Over and over again. Tell me it's not what it looks like, she said coldly. Jordan stared at the grainy image. He could have lied. Blamed paperwork. A mistake. He didn't. He just stood stiffly and said, I think I need a lawyer. Within days, he was suspended without pay. His badge confiscated. He was told not to contact anyone at the facility, especially not Claudine. But none of that mattered anymore, because what he'd done wasn't just against the rules. It was a felony. And if they proved it was consensual, it wouldn't matter. To the law, there is no such thing as consent between a guard and an inmate. Back in her cell, Claudine held a folded piece of paper against her chest, a note Jordan had slipped between the pages of Song of Solomon weeks earlier. It read, You are the first person who's ever seen me and didn't flinch. Now, she sat on her cot, hands on her stomach, and whispered, You're real. You're really here. She wasn't sure if she was talking to the baby, or to him, maybe both. But what she didn't know, what no one knew, was that Warden Monroe wasn't just trying to silence a scandal. She was about to start something much, much darker. By the time the second trimester began, Claudine was no longer just an inmate. She was a liability. To the Department of Corrections, her pregnancy was a bomb ticking quietly beneath their feet. To Warden Celeste Monroe, it was a personal insult. Her prison, her rules, and now her mess. She needed it gone. First came the isolation. Claudine was moved out of general population under the excuse of medical risk. Her belongings were taken. No books, no music, no cellmate, just 4 cold walls and a mattress thin enough to feel the concrete underneath. There were no more visits to the library, no more walks to the chapel. Her food arrived late, often cold, and occasionally missing entirely. When she asked the nurse for antacids, she received silence. When she asked to speak to a lawyer, she was told, You don't have rights. You have privileges. And right now, you ain't earned any. She wasn't just being punished. She was being erased. Then came the pills. One morning, Nurse Simmons entered with a paper cup of water and 2 white tablets. Prenatal vitamins, she muttered, not meeting Claudine's eyes. Claudine held the pills in her hand, staring at them. They looked nothing like the ones she had been given before. She crushed one between her fingers. It disintegrated like chalk. Something was wrong. She didn't take them. Instead, she kept the pills hidden in a folded napkin beneath her mattress. The next morning, she pretended to swallow again. Another 2 tablets. Same texture. Same bitter smell. On the 4th day, she pressed the pills inside a crack in the wall and waited. She didn't have to wait long. That evening, as the hallway lights dimmed, she heard the metallic rattle of keys and the distinct sound of high heels approaching. Warden Monroe entered the cell alone. No guards. No cameras. She stood at the doorway, arms crossed, eyes cold. You think I don't know what you're doing? She said. You think this place belongs to you just because some rookie couldn't keep it in his pants? Claudine sat silently on the cot, her hands resting protectively on her belly. You've been in this prison for almost 2 decades, Monroe continued. And after all that time, you're still dumb enough to think you can win. Claudine looked up, slow and steady. I'm not trying to win, she said quietly. I'm trying to survive. Warden Monroe stepped forward, close enough for Claudine to smell her perfume, sharp and artificial. You're not giving birth in my prison. Her voice dropped into a whisper. One way or another, this ends before your 3rd trimester. Then she turned, heels clicking back down the corridor, leaving only silence behind. Claudine didn't sleep that night. She pressed her hands to her stomach and whispered prayers she hadn't said since she was a little girl in Mississippi, sitting in a church pew next to her mother, long before prison bars and broken ribs, and men who raised fists instead of voices. The baby inside her was quiet, but she imagined it listening. She imagined it as a girl, strong, sharp-eyed, born with music in her bones. And she swore to that child, with every last ounce of her fading strength. They won't take you from me. I don't care if I die here. You're going to be born. Meanwhile, Jordan Miles was spiraling. His suspension had been upgraded to a formal investigation. His apartment had been searched. His phone seized. His bank accounts frozen. They hadn't charged him yet, but he could feel it coming. He tried calling lawyers. No one would take his case. Not after hearing pregnant inmate and young officer in the same sentence. His only ally now was his younger brother Elijah, barely 20, with cerebral palsy and an old soul. Elijah listened patiently as Jordan explained everything, his voice shaking with guilt. I didn't mean for this to happen, Jordan said. She wasn't a project. She wasn't a victim. I loved her. Elijah stared at him and said quietly, then fight for her, before they bury her too. Jordan sent an anonymous email to a local investigative reporter, attaching a scanned copy of the falsified medical logs and altered security schedules he had quietly collected during his time at the prison. He knew it wouldn't save him, but maybe, just maybe it could save her. 3 days later, that reporter made a call to the prison, asking questions. Too many questions. And that's when things took a deadly turn. It happened during a storm. The kind of southern summer thunderstorm that rattled windows and made the power flicker just long enough to remind everyone how vulnerable they really were. Lightning split the sky above St. Helena Women's Correctional Center, casting ghostly shadows through the high windows. And sometime between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m., Claudine Harris was found dead in her solitary confinement cell. The official report said cardiac arrest. The unofficial whispers said murder. Officer Janice Bell was the first to find her. She was making routine rounds when she noticed something odd. Claudine's light was on, but the camera feed for her cell had gone black. Interference from the storm, they said. The moment she opened the door, the silence hit her like a wall. Claudine lay on the mattress, one hand resting on her abdomen, her face turned toward the wall. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no bruises, except a faint purple ring around her neck. Janice called it in. Then she ran to the staff bathroom and vomited, because she had seen that kind of mark before. And it wasn't from cardiac arrest. By dawn, the prison was in full lockdown. Warden Monroe arrived before sunrise, her hair damp, her heels echoing down the concrete halls. She walked straight past the guards, past the other inmates pressing their faces to the bars, and in a Claudine's cell. She stood there for a long time, then quietly ordered, "Clear it, clean it, seal it. No photos leave this building." The autopsy would be conducted in-house under a prison contract pathologist. The cause of death would remain natural causes, and the baby, who hadn't made it past 14 weeks, would be listed as non-viable fetal tissue. Just another footnote in a forgotten woman's file. But someone did take a photo. It was blurry, taken by Officer Bell on her personal phone, just before the cleanup crew arrived. She sent it anonymously to the same reporter Jordan had reached out to days before. Within 48 hours, the image leaked to a local news blog. 62-year-old pregnant inmate dies in solitary. Prison says natural causes. The post didn't make national headlines. Not yet, but inside St. Helena, it lit a fuse. In the chapel, a group of inmates who once sang with Claudine in the choir held a silent vigil. They braided strips of cloth together and tied them to the metal bars of their cells. One woman carved Mama C into the wall above her bed. And in the library, where no one had touched the piano in weeks, someone played a single, haunting chord. Jordan found out 2 days later. He was at home, sleeping on a couch in his brother's apartment, when Elijah shook him awake and held out his phone. The headline hit him like a punch to the chest. He didn't cry, didn't scream. He just sat there, staring, silent, until finally, in a voice barely audible, he said, "They killed her." Just like that. And no one will be held accountable. Elijah looked at him, eyes wide with something between fear and grief. "What are you going to do?" Jordan stood up. "What I should have done from the start." The next day, Jordan packed a duffel bag. He left behind his ID, his phone, and his badge. He drove 3 hours south to a gun store he remembered from childhood and paid cash for a used .45 caliber handgun. Then, on the 7th day after Claudine's death, he returned to the place where it all began. He knew the guard rotation, knew the blind spots, knew where Warden Monroe kept her office key. He didn't plan on making it out alive. He just wanted her to look him in the eyes before it ended. That night, as thunder rolled across the Louisiana sky once more, Jordan Miles stepped into St. Helena one last time. And not everyone would walk away. It was just past 11 p.m. when Jordan Miles pulled into the staff parking lot of St. Helena Women's Correctional Center for the last time. He wore a black hoodie, jeans, and work boots, nothing to make him stand out, nothing to make him memorable. The old access badge he'd kept in his glove compartment still worked. No one had deactivated it. Maybe they didn't think he'd be reckless enough to come back. Maybe they underestimated how far a broken man in love would go. The building was quiet. Storms were moving in again. Heavy rain drummed against the roof. Thunder rumbling in the distance like the world holding its breath. Jordan moved through the halls like a ghost. Every step was muscle memory. Past the mess hall, past the chapel, toward the administrative wing. He passed the library without stopping. But he did glance at the piano inside, dark, untouched. Like her, Warden Celeste Monroe was still in her office, working late, as usual, reviewing reports, reshuffling staff schedules, trying to outrun the shadows nipping at her heels. She looked up when he stepped inside, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. For the first time in her career, she didn't feel in control. "Jordan," she began, standing slowly, "what the hell do you think you're doing?" He didn't answer. He closed the door behind him and locked it. Her hand drifted toward the emergency call button beneath her desk. He saw it. "I wouldn't," he said, calm as ice. Then he pulled out the gun. For a moment, silence ruled the room. Not fear, not chaos, just silence. Two people staring at each other in a cage of lies. "You killed her," Jordan said finally, his voice cracked but steady. "You gave her those pills. You put her in that cell. You had the cameras shut off, and now you want to pretend it was a heart attack." Monroe narrowed her eyes, recovering just enough to sneer. "She was a manipulative old woman who broke the law, and you were too stupid to realize she was using you. That was her mistake." Jordan didn't scream. He didn't raise the gun. He simply stepped closer, tears welling in his eyes, not just from grief, but rage and helplessness and a love that never got to live outside four walls. "She was the only person who ever saw me as more than a screw-up," he said. "She was carrying my child." Monroe's face flickered, just briefly, with something that looked like doubt. Maybe regret. Then it hardened again. "And now you'll carry that mistake to prison, just like her." Jordan raised the gun and pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the building, ricocheting off cement and steel. Warden Celeste Monroe collapsed behind her desk, blood pooling across the polished floor. The alarm blared seconds later. Jordan made no attempt to run. When the guards burst into the room with weapons drawn, they found him sitting cross-legged on the floor, the gun resting beside him, his hands lifted, shaking. He looked up at them and said just one sentence: "Tell the world what she did." Within hours, the story was everywhere. Pregnant inmate found dead in solitary. Young officer confesses to affair, kills warden. Who was Claudine Harris? The leaked photo, the missing footage, the falsified medical logs. All of it hit the news cycle like a tidal wave. Activist groups descended on the prison. Lawyers filed emergency motions. Protesters lit candles outside the facility gates with signs that read, "She deserved to live. Justice for Mama C." Claudine's name was finally said outside prison walls. Not as a number, not as a criminal, but as a woman. A woman who had loved. A woman who had tried. A woman who had carried a child in the most hopeless place on earth and paid the ultimate price for it. Meanwhile, Jordan awaited trial. Alone, unapologetic. In an interview from his jail cell, he looked into the camera and said, "If I had to do it again, I would still love her. The world might call it crime, but in that prison, it was the only thing that was real." The trial of Jordan Miles opened to a packed courtroom in a divided country. Some saw him as a fallen officer, guilty of murder. Others called him a whistleblower, a man destroyed by a system he once served. And at the center of it all, though buried 6 feet underground, was Claudine Harris. The prosecution painted a clear picture. Jordan violated his oath. He abused his position. He took a human life in cold blood. They called it premeditated homicide, but the defense called a reckoning. Led by civil rights attorney Renee Caldwell, the defense team argued that Jordan's actions were born not out of rage, but out of desperation, a direct result of institutional abuse and cover-ups that led to the death of a pregnant inmate who had no business being in solitary confinement to begin with. They submitted the leaked photos, the altered medical records, the witness testimony from Officer Janice Bell, the anonymous video of inmates recounting how Warden Monroe bragged about putting that old liar in her place. Then came Elijah Miles, Jordan's younger brother, called to the stand by the defense. His voice trembled as he described watching his brother transform, from a man trying to rebuild his life to one destroyed by guilt and grief. "He didn't kill out of hate," Elijah said. "He killed because no one would listen until someone bled." But it was the final witness that changed everything. A woman named Deborah Young, a retired corrections nurse who had once worked under Warden Monroe. She broke down in tears as she confessed. "We were told to shut her up, to medicate her, to make it look like her body failed, not the system. I stayed silent, and I'll regret it until the day I die." The jury went quiet. So did the courtroom. After 4 days of deliberation, the verdict was read. Guilty of voluntary manslaughter. Not guilty of murder in the first degree. Jordan was sentenced to 12 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 8. It wasn't freedom, but it wasn't life behind bars either. Following the trial, Claudine's story gained national attention. Her photo, taken in the prison library, smiling faintly over a worn copy of The Bluest Eye, became a symbol of quiet resistance. A nonprofit called Mama C's Voice was launched by a group of formerly incarcerated women. Its mission, to fight for pregnant inmates, prison health care reform, and the banning of solitary confinement for expectant mothers in U.S. prisons. Documentaries were made. College courses assigned her story. And for the first time, the Department of Corrections of Louisiana was forced to open an independent investigation into inmate deaths in solitary confinement over the past 20 years. The numbers were staggering, the silence deafening. Her grave, in a small church cemetery near New Orleans, was originally marked only by a simple plaque. But 1 year after her death, hundreds gathered there. They brought flowers, letters, handwritten songs, and someone placed a new headstone that read, "Claudine Harris, 1961 to 2023. She sang in silence. She died in chains, but her voice shook the walls." As for Jordan, he served time in a medium-security prison just 2 hours from where Claudine was buried. He kept to himself, taught GED classes to other inmates, played piano when allowed, and every year, on the anniversary of her death, he wrote a letter he couldn't send, addressed simply, "To you, and the child we never got to meet." 2 years after her death, the name Claudine Harris was read aloud on the floor of the U.S. Senate. It came from the lips of Senator Marissa Glenn, who held up a framed photo of Claudine beside the transcript of her prenatal records, altered, redacted, manipulated. She was 62, she was pregnant, and she died under the weight of a system that saw her as disposable. That moment became the turning point. It banned solitary confinement for pregnant inmates at the federal level. It required independent autopsies for all deaths occurring in restricted housing. It mandated outside legal oversight on the use of psychotropic medications in correctional facilities. It wasn't everything, but it was something. And in a country where the incarcerated are often forgotten before they're even judged, it was a start. In prisons across the country, women began requesting Mama's C journals, simple blank notebooks donated by nonprofits where they could write to their unborn children, to their past selves, or to no one at all. Some wrote about their pain. Some wrote about their hopes. Some just wrote Claudine's name over and over again, so it wouldn't fade like theirs had. Warden Monroe's replacement, a woman named Trina Long, tore down the solitary confinement unit and converted it into a counseling and support wing for pregnant and aging inmates. A mural now covers the far wall of what was once the isolation block. It shows a woman with silver hair seated at a piano, her hand resting on her belly, eyes closed as if listening for something only she could hear. Below her, in cursive script, are the words, "Let no one silence your song." And in the prison library, the place where it all began, there's a corner now called Claudine's Shelf, filled with music books, journals, and first editions of Black female authors. The piano has been restored. It is played every Friday by the inmates' choir. They don't sing hymns anymore. They sing Claudine's favorite spirituals, songs of loss, endurance, and quiet, defiant hope. He was released on parole after 8 years. He never returned to corrections work. Instead, he joined Mama C's voice as a quiet advisor, never speaking to the media, never chasing headlines. He lived simply, gave piano lessons in a dusty corner of Baton Rouge, visited her grave twice a year, kept her photo in his wallet, and every Sunday, he sat alone at an old upright piano in a church that never asked questions, playing for a woman whose voice still echoed through every key. They thought they buried her in silence, but her story became a storm. And in every cell, every courtroom, every cold and forgotten place where justice had been denied, someone, somewhere, was whispering her name, Claudine.